It is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. In the early 2nd century AD, a Roman legion vanished from the historical record.
They're not there, so at some point in the 2nd century, something happens to them, they disappear, they're disbanded, something.
Here you've got 5,500 soldiers of Rome's elite fighting army. What happens to them?
We do not know what happened to it. It literally disappears from history.
It remains one of the mysteries. We need to find out.
Now, with the help of leading experts, I'm going to dive deeper into the story.
I'm going to be travelling across Britain, visiting some of the key sites associated with the 9th Legion on this island. From the central role it played in helping extend Rome's control, to a brutal run-in with Britain's most famous warrior queen. The question of what happened to the 9th Legion has fascinated people for centuries. This is the story of the 9th Legion. I've always been interested in Roman history for as long as I can remember, but one of the key things that really sparked the interest was when my dad read to me this book, The Eagle of the Ninth, when I was 6 or 7 years old. First published in the 1950s, it was written by Rosemary Sutcliffe, and the story centres around a Roman legion, the 9th Legion, sent north from York to crush an uprising beyond Hadrian's Wall. But the legion never returned. It was destroyed, and its precious eagle standard was lost.
Rosemary Sutcliffe was a fantastic author. I mean, she's somebody who suffered through illness throughout her entire life and didn't get out much, but her imagination was amazing. And when The Eagle of the Ninth came out, it was such a captivating story. I guess, I mean, archaeologists can look at it today and say there are certain parts which don't quite ring true anymore, but the idea of a legion being lost in northern Britain, about a son trying to find out what happened to his father, about sort of loss of honour, trying to recover this eagle, and pinning it all to an archaeological discovery.
This archaeological discovery was the Silchester eagle. Discovered in the late 19th century, this Roman bronze cast eagle is extraordinary. Its talons are clawed over as if gripping onto something. Its head is tilted slightly to the right. Although it is now not believed to be a legionary eagle, it inspired Rosemary Sutcliffe to write her famous novel.
Rosemary Sutcliffe makes that brilliant link of saying this is possibly the eagle standard of the 9th Legion, and if it was, why is it in Silchester, in southern Britain, in Berkshire, and not anywhere near York where they may have died? So she's creating this fantastic story about people going north and, so spoiler alert, retrieving the eagle and bringing it south and giving it an honourable burial. So it's a fantastic story, and it's a real sort of boy's own heroic tale.
Although a fictional story, the Eagle of the Ninth has its roots in one of the great mysteries of ancient history.
In the 2nd century AD, Rome's 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, disappears from the historical record, vanishes. Over the decades, over the centuries, there have been many theories put forward as to what happened to this lost legion. But for me, what is just as interesting, what is just as amazing, is what we do know about Rome's 9th Legion, what we do know in particular about this legion during the just under 100 years that we're for certain sure that it spent in Roman Britain. Filled with military successes, but also some disastrous defeats, the story of the 9th Legion that we do know is worthy of an epic in its own right, and its story deserves to be told.
By the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean, possessing one of the most formidable military forces in history. Rome's conquering army was divided into legions, each one a unit containing just over 5,000 soldiers. Every legion had its own extraordinary story, and the 9th Legion was no exception.
Now, the interesting thing is that there were at least 2 Ninth Legions. So the first Ninth Legion originates in the 80s BC in the social wars in the later Roman Republic. And this then becomes an elite fighting force. It fights with Caesar throughout all of his campaigns in Gaul. The sanguinous conquest of Gaul, when he himself claims he killed 1 million and enslaved 1 million. Well, part of that story is the Ninth Legion, the original Ninth Legion. This Ninth Legion almost certainly came to Britain in at least one of Caesar's 2 incursions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC. And this same Ninth Legion then participates in his later campaigns, fighting Pompey in the Balkans, Macedonia and in Greece, the Battle of Pharsalus, and then in North Africa and then in Spain. It's an elite legion. But the year before Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, it is disbanded, and we don't know why. But in true Roman fashion, within 2 years, it's reformed. So after Caesar's death, Octavian reforms it, and it again becomes another elite legion. So it fights through all the major campaigns of the later civil wars. It fights at Philippi. Then when he becomes Augustus after being called emperor for the first time by the Senate in 27 BC, it fights in his Cantabrian Wars in Spain. So it's participating in all the major conflicts of Octavian, later Augustus's reign. So this is an elite legion.
But the Ninth's record of service was soon stained by an infamous event.
For the first time, we see it in a negative light, because there's an occasion when it rebels. And interestingly, this is a theme which you can see then threaded through the rest of the history of the Ninth Legion. No longer is it this bright shining light, this true heroic Roman legion, but suddenly things start over time, over a long chronology, to go wrong. In this first instance, in the beginning of the 1st century AD, you have this rebellion, this insurrection involving the legion. Ultimately, the legion then comes back into the front line again of the Roman military, and latterly it is chosen as one of the 4 legions to take part in the Claudian Invasion of Britain under Aulus Plautius on behalf of the Emperor Claudius, AD 43, and it plays a key role in the invasion.
By the end of 43 AD, the Romans had reached Camalodunum, modern-day Colchester, and here the Emperor Claudius received the surrenders of British chiefs. The invasion was at an end. The province of Britannia was declared. It had ended in success. The Emperor Claudius, he had his conquest. But for the Ninth, the fighting was far from over.
We've got Roman troops essentially heading west and northwards. It's vital to go west, because although the tribes predominantly in the south and east are on Rome's side, they understand the need for good relationships with Rome, and a lot of their leaders are very pro-Roman. To the west, you've got the good mineral resources, you've got the gold in central Wales, you've got lead and tin in the West Country, you've got a whole range of sort of materials which will make Britain economically viable if you can start mining that. So it's vital that the troops go west and start to incorporate that bit into the Roman Empire. But the trouble is, going west is you've got tribes and people who've had no history of contact with Rome, so they're not necessarily on Rome's side, they haven't traded with Rome.
Resistance remained in the west, riled up by a British leader called Caratacus.
That's a problem, because the Emperor Claudius has gone back to Rome and said it's all over, the conquest is complete, and yet there's still this character who is loose, who is causing trouble. It's that sense of you can't complete the conquest until Caratacus is brought back in Rome in chains or is dead. So he becomes the major target for the Romans. They have to get him if they can convince the rest of the Roman Empire that the conquest of Britain is finished.
Yet as Rome was dealing with Caratacus and this resistance in the west, the Ninth was heading in a different direction.
The Ninth Legion is going up the east coast as far as we can see. I mean, the good thing about the Roman legions is they all, whenever they're building a fort, they stamp their tiles. So we've got a lot of numbers. We can see the 2nd Legion is going down towards Dorset and Exeter. The 20th and the 14th Legions are going up into Wales, up towards Anglesey. And the 9th Legion seems to be going up the eastern seaboard, going towards Lincoln and then up eventually towards York. So to begin with, the 9th isn't involved directly in the war against Caratacus, but it is involved in trying to make sure that the eastern side of Britain is kept secure, and more critically the northern frontier is secure, because to the north you've got this the tribe, the Brigantes, which is a massive tribal confederation, really from southern Yorkshire right the way up to Northumberland, covering an immense area. If they're peaceful And if they can be persuaded to be on Rome's side, then the rest of the soldiers can move into Wales. They can start hunting down Caratacus. And also the Ninth can stop Caratacus from going northwards and trying to foment rebellion up there too. So they have a very important role early on, but they're not directly involved with the war against the British leaders.
By 60 AD, the 9th Legion had played a central role in helping Rome establish the fledgling Roman province of Britannia. It had played a key role in the invasion. It had played a key role in the breakout campaigns. It had established itself on Rome's northern edge, founding a legionary fortress at Lincoln. But it would be then that the 9th faced its greatest challenge to date, a massive British revolt led by one of the most famous warrior women in our island's history.
Boudica was the queen of a British tribe called the Iceni, who were a Roman client tribe or a client state. So actually, nominally, they were allies of Rome, and the Romans did deals with some of the populations when they conquered a territory. If it would save them time in the conquest of the more difficult parts of the territory, do a deal with one of the tribes which are more acquiescent, and this is the Iceni, who are in North Norfolk. So doing a deal with them allowed the Legion of the 9th to actually start its campaign in the Midlands and the North. All well and good. However, jump forward to AD 60-61. Boudica's husband dies, and in his will he's left his kingdom, as a client state, his kingdom, half to his daughters and half to Rome. Now, when you're a client state, the usual way of doing things is for the monarch who dies to leave all of his kingdom to Rome. So this actually gets the backs of the Romans up, and there's trouble. And the Romans send troops to force the Iceni to give up all of their territory, all of their portable wealth, possibly, to the Romans. And this sparks an insurrection. Some of the stories we hear at this point are of the Roman moneylenders calling in their loans to the aristocratic nobles of the Iceni, who they've lent money to become effectively Roman, to build grand public buildings, to wear togas, to educate their children in Latin in Rome. And by calling in the money, they're bankrupted. So an insurrection takes place. Also, we hear from the primary sources that maybe Boudica herself was ill-treated and her daughters raped as well. Whatever the truth, there's a major problem, and a rebellion starts. And it becomes a conflagration. Eventually, the whole of the southeast erupts into flames, and we have the Boudican revolt.
For the 9th, stationed to the northwest, this was a major problem.
Now, at the time of the Boudican revolt, the 9th Legion is based in its very recently founded legionary fortress at Lincoln. It would have had vexillations based further south, but the majority of troops would have been at Lincoln. However, given that the revolt is in North Norfolk, they're the first responders. And imagine the scene. You've got Boudica marching down from North Norfolk. She's approaching Colchester, the provincial capital, where Claudius earlier announced the province of Britannia to exist. The commander, the legate of the Legion, Cerealis, decides to put together an emergency force from the 9th Legion. Probably no more than 2,000 men, so less than half the Legion. So vexillations of legionaries, and also maybe auxiliaries, especially auxiliary cavalry. And they hot-foot it down to try to intercept Boudica as she marches from North Norfolk down to Colchester.
But things didn't go as planned.
First, they get there too late, so when they get to Colchester, it's been torched, and all the Roman colonial settlers there have been killed. Secondly, when they eventually do engage Boudica and her force, which by this time may have amounted to maybe 100,000, we're only talking about 2,000 Romans here. So even though of those 100,000 native Britons in revolt, only a small percentage may have been actual warriors, still the odds against the Romans here are huge. Nevertheless, Cerealis with his 2,000 men tries to intercept Boudica, and he's defeated to the extent where he runs away. So the legionary legate, the general in charge of the legion, legs it, and he goes with his guard cavalry, and they go and hide in a fort nearby until the Boudican revolt's put down. So the first story we have of the 9th Legion fighting a battle in terms of the Boudican revolt is very negative indeed.
The battle was a catastrophic defeat for Cerealis and his portion of the 9th Legion. It was the first major military disaster that we know of that the Romans had suffered on this island. By the end of the day, perhaps as many as 2,000 legionaries had perished. Boudicca's revolt would ultimately be put down at the Battle of Watling Street and in its aftermath, but the damage Boudica and her warriors had dealt to the 9th Legion was severe. It was in desperate need of replenishing, and we hear in the aftermath of the revolt 2,000 more legionaries being sent to Britain, many of whom would have been sent straight to the 9th to replenish that dented legion. And we know the 9th was replenished because soon enough we hear of this legion back in the field once more.
Now, if we jump forward in time to the AD 70s, the 9th Legion comes back into focus again, but with the same guy involved, the same Roman leader, Cerealis. But this time, Cerealis isn't the failed legionary legate, having lost his battle with Boudica. He's now rebuilt his reputation with the new Flavian dynasty in the context of the Batavian revolt, and he becomes the governor of Britain. And he gets given orders to create wealth and create glory for the new Flavian dynasty. And he gets told to conquer the far north of Britain, which includes the Brigantes tribe in the north. And the 9th Legion gets given orders to march north and begin this conquest process. The first thing they do is they march to the River Ouse, where they then build another legionary fort, and this is today's York.
York has its fair share of extraordinary Roman history. In 306 AD, Constantine I, better known as Constantine the Great, was proclaimed emperor here by his soldiers, probably very near to where I'm standing now, at the Principia, the heart of Roman York, which is today underneath York Minster. Almost 100 years earlier, another Roman emperor, Septimius Severus, he came to York too. He established it as his capital for 3 years when he went campaigning further north in the heartlands of what is today Scotland. He ultimately died here in 211. And 100 years, more than 100 years before that, that was when York was first established as a legionary fortress with the 9th Legion. It's quite surreal to think that all this incredible Roman history, well, it began with Legio 9 Hispana.
The 9th Legion were the builders of Roman York. They established here in the year 71 AD the first Roman structures in this part of the country, the first fortress of Eboracum, which was initially built out of earth and timber and then was later rebuilt in stone. And you can still see remnants of it here in York today.
York, as we understand it today, is essentially a Roman creation. It's a legionary fortress for the 9th. Now, legions are usually they're not on the front line, they're often away back, and it's the auxiliaries, the less well-paid troops that do the policing duties. But York is established as a major centre point, a major node in Rome's conquest of Britain, and that's the 9th. So the 9th is the most northerly of all the legions. So we've got the 20th Legion at Chester, we've got the 2nd at Caerleon in South Wales, but the 9th is primarily that unit on the northern frontier. So its role has always been heading northwards. It probably of all the legions, it better understands the Brigantes, the tribes to the north.
Those soldiers of the 9th Legion stationed at York were helping keep an eye over large swathes of territory owned by peoples such as the Brigantes. And archaeology survives that tells us more about one particular figure.
We're very lucky in the Yorkshire Museum to have some wonderful tombstones that provide really personal insights into individuals. This is one of them. This is the wonderful tombstone or tomb marker of an individual called Lucius Ducius Rufinus. This individual, Lucius, was a soldier in the 9th Legion, and by looking closely at his tomb marker, we can tell a lot about him. If we look at how Rufinus is depicted in the tombstone, we can learn a lot about his role within the 9th Legion. You can see that he's holding a decorated pole in his left hand. Now that's a standard, and this tells us that he had a specific role in the Legion as a standard bearer. There would be one of these per century, that's around 80 soldiers, and they would support the centurion who was the head of that group. They had a very specific role in battle. They needed to make sure that all the fighting soldiers knew where their centurion was to keep morale up, and it was by holding this decorated pole high within the melee way that they were able to do this. It's a very important and also a very dangerous role. Because they were holding this standard, they weren't able to protect themselves with a shield. What's so fantastic about this object is that it puts a name, a face and a personality to a member of the 9th Legion. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly when Rufinus died, but we think it's quite likely that he was one of the first soldiers that was stationed here in Roman York, so one of the builders of the city.
Not all of the 9th would remain in and around York. During the late 1st century AD, detachments, or vexellations, were sent across Britain, as well as to the continent for service on the Rhine. But its most significant campaign would be under the command of one of the most renowned Roman governors of Britain.
Agricola is one of those governors of Britain for whom we actually know quite a lot, and that's because his son-in-law Tacitus wrote a biography. In fact, it's less of a biography, it's more of a sort of hagiography. It's a very sort of positive story about how great and wonderful his father-in-law was and all the wonderful things he did for Rome. But it's useful from our point of view because it gives us a sort of a year-by-year account.
So Agricola is probably the only Roman governor who could actually claim to have conquered the far north of Britain. And part of this process in his campaigns from, let's say, AD 78 through AD 83 involved directly, absolutely directly, the 9th Legion. The 9th Legion at the time, one of 4 Roman legions in Britain, playing a key role in his campaigns, marching from the north of the province. Remember, at this time, the border's probably around the Solway Firth to the Tyne, so we're going north into the Scottish borders, and then we're going further north into Fife, and then further north into the Upper Midland Valley, just shy of the Highland line, and then we're going even further north towards the Moray Lowlands. So this is a real attempt to conquer the far north of Britain.
One key place where we see the remains of extensive military activity by Agricola is in Perthshire.
And then they get to around a place called Inchtudel in Perthshire, and that's where they build a legionary fortress. It's the big fort in Scotland, the next nearest being York. They don't quite finish that, but we know they're campaigning around there. They're building their forts in around Perthshire.
I've come to the remains of Ardogh Roman fort in Scotland. Now, the fort here was first constructed by the Romans in the 1st century AD during the Flavian period. And the remains of the Flavian fort here can be seen. It's very extensive, the far reaches of the ditches visible to this day here.
Ardogh is a Roman fort in central Scotland in Perthshire, and it's one of the best surviving examples of its type anywhere in the Roman Empire. As you can see from the massive ramparts and ditches around its perimeter, it survives in really good quality condition.
The fort itself is an incredibly well-preserved fort. A number of rampart and ditches still survive. It's on the route into the Highlands. Just slightly north of that, we seem to get a fortified signalling chain. Ardogh has a key role in that. It is pivotal. It is controlling activity in this area.
Obviously, when you visit Ardogh today, it seems quite quiet and peaceful, the wind blowing across a relatively empty field. You get to the ramparts and then you get an idea of the majesty. But what that does is hide the hive of activity that you'd have had going on there. You would have had these wooden barrack blocks, you would have had the headquarters building. You've got to imagine the noise of hundreds of men. You'd have had soldiers on guard at night time, and you've really got to imagine something that's quite busy. And often it's good to actually have a think about when you've watched some film or a television programme that's actually shown the Roman army, the battle scene at the beginning of Gladiator when they all come back and they're in the camp afterwards. And it shows you an image of something that's really quite dirty and smelly. And I think you've got to conjure up, this isn't this lovely windswept moor. This was a busy, active place full of soldiers.
So Ardogh, it's beautifully preserved with all of these deep ditches, these fortifications. You can just imagine what it would have originally looked like with a wooden wall surrounding it. It's an absolutely astonishing sight. And it may also very tentatively, have a link to the 9th Legion. Now, when I say tentative link to the 9th, I mean very, very tentative. We have no evidence that the 9th was ever here. But the key for me was that we believe that this fort was first constructed, as I mentioned, in the Flavian period, so probably during the campaign of Agricola in the north, of which we know the 9th served.
Some forts, you're lucky enough to find something that actually gives you a date, like a coin hoard or something that actually has the latest date, which at least helps you to do that. We don't have that evidence for our dock, but we do have plenty of evidence shown that it was occupied in the 80s AD, so very much contemporary with Agricola's campaigns and would have been occupied when he was operating in Scotland.
Could the 9th Legion have been here at some point during that campaign? It's possible, but we don't know for sure. By AD 82, Agricola's campaign in the north had met with some astonishing success. He had constructed forts as far north as Perth, including perhaps this one, beautifully preserved at our dock. He had secured the land south of the Firth and the Clyde. He had campaigned on the islands to the west, and he had even, according to his son-in-law Tacitus, contemplated a future invasion of Ireland. But Agricola's campaign was far from finished.
Agricola returned his attention to the north, using the fleet and army in tandem to pressure his foe, the Caledonians, who put up a fierce resistance. The Caledonians went on the offensive, attacking forts and damaging Roman morale. The Caledonian assaults were terrifying and seemingly relentless, as the 9th Legion was about to find out.
To combat this Caledonian aggression, Agricola decided to divide his army into 3 separate sections, the weakest of which, according to Tacitus, was the 9th Legion. Now, why was the 9th the weakest? Well, perhaps some of the unit was elsewhere at the time, but now the 9th was exposed and the Caledonians pounced.
The 9th Legion, somewhere probably in the Upper Midland Valley, so just shy of the Highlands, is in a marching camp. And remember, a Roman military unit, specifically a legion, at the end of every night when they're campaigning in enemy territory, builds a marching camp. This is to defend itself from being attacked overnight, which proves very relevant here because on this given evening in AD 82, so we are told by Tacitus, the Roman historian, in his Agricola, the native Britons in the far north, we'll call them the Caledonians, attack in force, completely out of the blue, and almost overwhelm this entire legion of 5,500 men in its marching camp.
According to Tacitus, the sentries were caught off guard and the Caledonians got into the camp itself. What followed was anarchy. It must have been hell on earth. The 9th unprepared, the enemies swirling all around them. A nightmare.
Most Roman forts are designed so that troops can get out. They don't want to sit behind their walls, penned in. They've got multiple gateways, they can get out as quickly as they can form up in the field, and then they can fight an enemy as they're trained to do so. But the 9th are caught in their fort.
So the 9th Legion is in danger of being overwhelmed by the Caledonians who are attacking in force. Tacitus says that Agricola arrives in the nick of time to save the legion from being annihilated.
He sent reinforcements, he sent his cavalry, and just in the nick of time, whilst the 9th were holding out, they managed to get some sort of order. Agricola's reinforcements came and routed the attacking Caledonians. The 9th was saved from total destruction, but the damage it had suffered was severe.
We don't know how many losses they suffered, but they go from being a premier fighting unit to one that has suffered significant losses. And later on, at the major battle of Mons Graupius, the legions, and specifically the 9th, does not take part. Agricola sends all his less well-paid auxiliary soldiers into the front line. They get mown. They're like cannon fodder. You know, it doesn't matter how many of them die because they're not ultimately Roman, but the legions are kept in reserve, and it might be that groups like the 9th have been so badly mauled by that stage that they're not fighting fit, and therefore they're not actually able to do the job.
This deadly night attack on the 9th Legion is an extraordinary story. But did it really happen?
The archaeological record and what is happening to the 9th are two very different things. We don't have any information that the enemy was burning down the fortification. We've got no archaeological evidence of that. The text itself says they just killed a few people. It doesn't say they were burning it down. So we don't really know what was happening. We've not found any evidence of dead Roman soldiers that have obvious marks of being slaughtered. We don't have the same about indigenous population. We don't have any sort of battle site. So the archaeology is not clear. In terms of the 9th Legion, we don't know where it happened, when it happened, and we have no archaeological evidence for that. Doesn't mean to say it didn't happen, it just means that we haven't discovered that, or perhaps Tacitus was just spinning a bit of a tall tale there.
What's so interesting about this infamous night attack, this mauling that the 9th suffers in Scotland, is that this is the last literary reference we ever hear of the 9th Legion.
It's the last time the 9th Legion is ever mentioned in history. Ever. That's it. It's never again mentioned in history.
So what happened to it? In the next episode, we look at what the archaeology can tell us.
That's the point where they disappear.
So it did not take part in building the wall. For whatever reason, it wasn't around by then in Britain.
The possibility of them being lost somewhere on the Rhine, or just a disbandment.
As we dive into the mystery of the Lost Legion. In the last episode, we tracked the 9th's history right up to its last mention in the literature. A deadly night attack suffered somewhere in central Scotland in 82 AD, at the height of Agricola's campaigns in the north.
It's the last time the 9th Legion is ever mentioned in history. Ever. That's it. It's never again mentioned in history.
So what happened next? Well, to continue the story, we must now turn our attention to the archaeology.
Following the end of Agricola's campaign in Scotland, the 9th ultimately returned to its legionary fortress at York. And it's here that we have the next key in the story, the next key archaeological find, an inscription dating to the early 2nd century AD, which is located here at the Yorkshire Museum.
This monumental inscription is a dedication to the rebuilding of a major gateway in stone, and this gateway was probably part of the Roman fortress, most likely the major southeastern entrance to the fortress. The inscription is written in contracted Latin, and it's actually only the last line that tells us that this has anything to do with the 9th Legion at all. The first few lines of the inscription are actually dedicated to the Roman emperor at the time, Trajan, and it's essentially a list of his honours, titles and roles, which form a fairly extensive CV. We can see that we have Imp for Imperator or Emperor, and he's also listed as Pontifex Maximus or Chief Priest of the Empire.
The great thing about those sort of inscriptions is, they're not great literary texts, they just say who built this and the name of the emperor, and usually when you're citing an emperor you get a whole list of his titles, and because the titles change every year you can pinpoint the exact time that inscription dates to. So it's set up by the 9th Legion and it's dedicated to the Emperor Trajan, and the list of titles that he is given dates from December 107 AD to December 108. So we've got that 12-month period where that inscription is put in. But that's the last definitive physical evidence that we've got for the 9th Legion. After 108, that's the point where they disappear. So we know that in 108 they're in York, they're repairing the gateway. We know very little about what happens to them afterwards.
It's astonishing to think that that inscription is the last reference we have to the 9th Legion in Britain. After that, it's gone.
Within 15 years of this inscription, we find a new legion based at York, the 6th Victrix.
They were instrumental in rebuilding the Roman fortress here. The Multangular Tower, which you can see in the museum gardens here in York, which is the corner tower of the fortress. It has 10 sides, hence its name, the Multangular Tower, is the finest standing remains that show the activity of the 6th.
Now, at the start of the 2nd century AD, the 6th Victrix had been stationed on the Rhine, but in around AD 120, latest AD 122, the 6th was transferred to northern Britain, to the legionary fortress at York, Roman Eboracum. Now, why is this so significant in the story of the 9th? Well, the 9th had been stationed at York, but it seems now almost certain that by the time the 6th arrives at York, the 9th has gone. The York legionary fortress, it wasn't large enough to fit 2 full legions. So it suggests that by that time, the 9th had gone. And this seems to be further affirmed that maybe the 9th isn't in Britain at all by Hadrian's great legacy on this island, the remains of which you can still see today. Hadrian's Wall.
Every unit which participated in building it left an inscription. Here, there, graffiti, official, every single unit. There's no inscription at all from 9 Hispana. So it did not take part in building the wall. For whatever reason, it wasn't around by then in Britain.
It is argued that the 9th was building part of the wall and hasn't left any inscriptions. The western sector of Hadrian's Wall was actually built in turf, so they could have created inscriptions in wood, and we have one from a different legion, which have completely disappeared. I don't like that theory. It doesn't fit with how I understand the building of Hadrian's Wall took place, which was in sectors of 5 miles apiece, and these sectors divide into 3 blocks of 5 miles, which suggests there's only 3 legions building in Britain, the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th, not the 9th.
So it appears that the legion was no longer in Britain by 122 AD, and we know that less than 50 years later, the 9th legion is no longer in existence anywhere.
In AD 168, we have a column being built in Rome, which is called the Colonnella Maffei. And this lists all the legions which are extant in the Roman Empire at the time. Probably at any one time in the Roman Empire, Principate period anyway, there are probably 30 odd legions. That's the case here. And we can date it because it's got the Italica legions listed, which are created around the time of the Marcomannic Wars. So we can date it fairly accurately. And on that column, which lists all the legions in existence in the Roman Empire at the time, in AD 168, the 9th Legion isn't there. It's gone.
So what happened to the 9th Legion? Well, there have been a number of theories put forwards over the decades, indeed over the centuries, and to this day it remains the subject of heated scholarly debate.
So the starting point is to look at where we first became aware that it disappears from history. And this is with an antiquarian in the 1730s called John Horsley. John Horsley did an analysis of the entry and exit of every Roman legion to Britain, which still to this day, in actual fact, stands up to rigour, academic rigour. And he determined that the only one he couldn't work out where it went to, what happened to it, was the 9th Legion. And since that time, people looking elsewhere in the empire have drawn the same conclusion. Jump forward to the 1850s and you have a German academic, one of the leading Roman historians of his day, a leading antiquarian called Theodor Mommsen. And Theodor Mommsen wrote a multi-volume history of the Roman Empire. And in it, he took Horsley's observation about the disappearance of the 9th Legion and he started investigating it, and he came up with a hypothesis of himself, which he published in the later 1850s. And his hypothesis was that this legion had arrived, as we know, with the Roman invasion of Britain by Aulus Plautius on behalf of Claudius in AD 43, and it participated in all manifestations of the conquest campaigns. But later, something happens in the north, and it gets wiped out. And his theory was it was in York, and there was an insurrection of the local brigantes in the far north of Britain, and they attacked York, which was the legionary base for the 9th Legion, and wiped it out. And this was the starting point of all the analysis about what really happened to the 9th Legion.
Mommsen centred his theory around the belief that northern Roman Britain was in a state of unrest in the early 2nd century, caused by imperial neglect.
Now, the interesting thing about the province of Britain at the beginning of the 2nd century AD is it's fairly quiet, because most of the military action is taking place well away from this northwestern corner of the Roman Empire. So, for example, the AD 108 reference to Trajan in the legionary fortress in York, while Trajan's spending most of his time fighting in Dacia, and then later fighting the Parthians in the Middle East. So there's very little action in his reign taking place compared to that in Britain.
I think, if anything, Britain has been progressively ignored. You know, it's an island away from the major centre of things. It's in barbarian territory. It's not top of the list of Rome's sort of concerns. And Trajan, emperor just before Hadrian, his concerns is winning military victory, military glory in the east, and also by having great big conquests. He doesn't think about Britain. Britain's done as far as the Romans are considered. It's been conquered. So his role is really taking soldiers out of Britain and putting them somewhere else. And you get the feeling that, I guess, those governors sent to the province, those soldiers serving there, feel increasingly abandoned, and they're not getting the attention that they deserve.
When Trajan died in August 117, his successor, Hadrian, inherited a Britannia rife with instability.
Now this is my old second-hand copy of the text, the ancient text, that is the Historia Augusta. And in it, it has a biography of the Emperor Hadrian. And interestingly, in this copy, in this text, it records how when Hadrian came to the throne, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control.
That's a nice, vague statement. We don't know whether that means that Britons in the province are rebelling or there's an invasion from outside Roman territory. But the suggestion is, for the fact that it's noticed by a sort of a court biographer, a biographer of Hadrian, suggests that it's a major incident. And later on, we're told that when Hadrian comes to power, there are two significant disasters, militarily speaking. We're told great numbers of soldiers killed by the Jews, great numbers by the Britons. The Jewish wars we know a lot about. We've got lots of literary texts for that. We've got to know nothing about what's going on in Britain. But it does suggest, if the situation is in Britain as bad as it is in Judea in the east, then we are talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of people being killed, troops being in disarray.
Our source for this unrest is Cornelius Fronto, a senator writing some 2 generations after the events. Fronto was a well-placed figure within the imperial regime, but he doesn't tell us the cause of this trouble. One possibility could lie in the political makeup of Roman Britain at that time.
So in the north and the west, the whole local economy is bent towards maintaining the Roman military presence there, needed to maintain this border, which by that time dropped back down to the line of, say, the Solway Firth to the Tyne. And therefore your experience of living in Roman Britain, if you're in the south and the east, is very different to the north and the west. But that means also that if you're one of the natives in the north and the west, you're not going to be as enamoured with the experience of being part of Roman Britain as if you were in the south and the east. And to that end, many people believe that the native tribes in the north, and particularly the huge confederation called the Brigantes, who effectively run from Chester all the way through to the Scottish borders, that whole area of northern England today and the Scottish borders, they were very, very recalcitrant members, as it were, of the Roman Empire.
I think the Brigantes, they never become wholly Roman. There are pockets of Romanness. When you look at Alba, you've got mosaics and you've got some degree of prosperity. But to all intents and purposes, you'll still see native farmsteads and areas really much as they were before. It's a dispersed population with small sort of farming units. Some are directly under the control of Rome because they're near a Roman fort. But generally speaking, I think the Brigantes never become wholly Roman, not like the Atrebates or the Cativalorni to the south, who become very Romanised, and you've got villas and temples and towns. The Brigantes aren't like that at all. Although they lose their independence, they never really become a functioning part of the Roman Empire. So the fact that military is there is always a negative impact on them.
Now, we know that more Roman soldiers came to Britain during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. The sic Victrix, for example, may even have come to Britain with Hadrian himself when he visited this island in around 122 AD. And we also know that other soldiers ventured to Britain at this time. A tombstone discovered near Rome for a certain Titus Pontius Sabinus records how he led a detachment of 3,000 soldiers to Britain on a British expedition. Now, could this expedition be linked to unrest in the north of the province, a Brigantes revolt? We don't know, but it's possible.
I think of all the tribes, if we're told that the Britons could not be kept under control, as Roman historians said, I think the most likely to rebel at that stage would have been the Brigantes. Of course, the 9th Legion at York is right in the centre of that. So if there is a rebellion, they're going to be on the front line of that. They're the ones who are going to have to deal with that as best they can. And because Britain has been such a neglected part of the Roman Empire, and there's no formal frontier created, they are in the problem. They've got potential attack from the north, from those tribes who are not part of the Roman Empire. They've got the potential of the Brigantes rebelling against them, and they've got problems with instability in the south spreading north. So of all the legions, of all the military units in the province, the 9th are the most exposed.
The building of Hadrian's Wall may also be a suggestion for unrest in the area, and not just to the north.
I think the thing is really when Hadrian's Wall is built, when he creates that frontier, we tend to think of it as a wall to keep out all the perils of the north, the barbarians to the north, to keep them out of Roman Britain. It's just as much a wall to tell the Brigantes, you're not getting any more support from anyone else. You are stuck inside Roman Britain now. So it's much as facing north as it's facing south. It's a permanent border, and it tells them you're in Roman territory, you've got to just suck it up. You are going to be Roman, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So the evidence does seem to suggest that at least the north of Britain was in some state of revolt, of unrest, of some instability in the early 2nd century AD. But could this be linked to the 9th's disappearance?
Well, the blunt answer is yes. Mommsen's theory was that it had been overwhelmed in an attack by the Brigantes on York, which was the legionary fortress in its home. Rosemary Sutcliffe's conceit was that it was defeated in an offensive operation in the far north of Britain. Either of those two could be accurate. The reality is, though, we'll never know, because there is absolutely no historical or archaeological evidence anywhere to say either was the case. A third sub-hypothesis could be that it was actually lost in a region-wide conflagration in the north and the unconquered far north, akin to the Boudiccan revolt. So 1, a Brigantian revolt; 2, it was defeated in an offensive operation in the far north; 3, a conflagration of the entire north of the province and the unconquered far north. All 3 could have happened, but we have no evidence for it.
The theory that the 9th was lost somewhere in northern Britain in the 2nd century AD is certainly the strongest in popular imagination. But the case is far from closed. It's important to remember that the Roman province of Britannia was just a fragment of a much larger empire that stretched the length and breadth of the Mediterranean and beyond. And it is within this much wider context that we must continue our narrative.
The AD 108 inscription from York is the last attested mention of the 9th Legion in Britain, but it's not quite the last mention we hear of the 9th from anywhere in the Roman Empire. Tombstones dating to the mid-2nd century AD survive on various frontiers of the Roman Empire which mention the deceased serving in the 9th Legion, or at least being related to the 9th Legion in some way or form. And one of the most interesting of these tombstones comes from a far-flung frontier, not in Britain, but on an eastern edge of the Roman Empire.
Well, the evidence we've got from inscriptions includes one from the far end of the empire at Petra. Petra's got some fantastic tombs cut into the rock. I mean, we're all familiar with the treasury from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But as you explore Petra further, there are wonderful tombs, and one of these is to a man called Florentinus, who was governor of that province. And we know something about his career, not least also because we know his two predecessors as governor, so we can date him pretty closely to the late 120s. And his previous post but one was tribune in the 9th Legion. And these posts usually last for 3 years. So if we take the career as being normal, that is changing posts every 3 years, would bring him into the early 120s for service in the 9th Legion.
Further inscriptions have been discovered elsewhere. In Rome, a memorial was set up to the senator Lucius Aemilius Carus in the mid-2nd century AD, which highlights, among the man's many other achievements, how Carus had previously served as a military tribune in the 9th Legion. Meanwhile, at the Roman legionary fortress of Lambysis near Tazult in modern-day Algeria, a dedication by soldiers of the 3rd Legion to their commander, Lucius Novius Crispinus, was discovered. Similar to Carus, this inscription, believed to have been erected sometime around 150 AD, records how Crispinus had previously served in the 9th Legion. These inscriptions have allowed some scholars to put forward a different argument for the fate of the 9th Legion. An argument where the 9th was not destroyed in the early 2nd century.
Well, we come back to Emily Rittling's article in 1925, where he looked at these career inscriptions. His argument was that these career inscriptions suggested that the 9th Legion was still in existence into the 120s, and Eric Burley looked again at the evidence and suggested one of these career inscriptions indicates that the 9th Legion was still in existence, perhaps even up to 130. So what came out suddenly was a ping of, if you like, disbelief in how people had, previous to that point, seen the end of the 9th Legion. He said, no, it can't have happened, can't have been destroyed in the early years of Hadrian's reign, because in the later years of Hadrian's reign, the careers of these officers suggest that it was still in existence.
More evidence has been uncovered since. A diploma, dating to around 140 AD, mentions how a certain Quintus Camurius Numisius Junior had previously served in Legio 9 Hispana.
So this is pushing the survival of the 9th possibly even further on.
So, if the 9th was not lost in Britain, the question is, where did it meet its end? Now, one theory is that the 9th was transferred to the Rhine, to the legionary fortress at Nijmegen, because it's here that we find a rare mention of the 9th outside of Britain.
Now, we do know that certainly a vexillation, so a unit from the 9th Legion, was deployed to the legionary fortress at Nijmegen sometime before AD 108 and AD 120. Not the whole legion, just a vexillation. And we know this because we have the stamps on the tiles they manufactured as part of the rebuilding process of the legionary fortress. The really interesting thing there is that it's not the usual 9th Legion stamp, because usually that's a 1 and an X. This actually is a V1111, and the only vexillation we know of anywhere in Roman Britain from the 9th Legion which stamped its tiles like that was based near Carlisle. So you probably have a vexillation based in the northwest of Roman Britain being redeployed for some reason to Nijmegen, probably for a short period of time. But there's no evidence at all that it carried out any fighting. And if you look at the major conflagration on the Danube in particular in the later 2nd century AD, the Marcomannic Wars with Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus and later Commodus, there's no evidence at all it took place or it even existed.
Now, given the lack of evidence for fighting along the Rhine at this period, it's unlikely that this was where the 9th disappeared. And it's a similar case for the River Danube. But there is one other area of the Roman Empire that we know for sure in the 2nd century AD that there was vicious fighting, that there was bloody conflict at this time.
To the east, Rome was involved in a series of bloody conflicts, particularly in Judea.
Now, it's not unusual when you have major incidents, either offensive or defensive in the Roman Empire, to have military units transferred all over the empire. It's probably more unusual than not to have a legion transferred from Britain in the extreme northwest of empire to the extreme eastern frontier in Syria. But it could have happened.
Generally speaking, only detachments of legions were moved, which is what we come down to with Nijmegen and with just a detachment there. But there's still, for some years after this, another 30 or 40 years after 108 and the legion last recorded in Britain, whole legions were still being moved around the empire. So it's not impossible that the 9th was simply uprooted and transferred eastwards.
There is a series of events which could have been the context for the transference. You have the 3 exceptionally sanguinous Jewish revolts. The Great Revolt in the AD 60s and 70s, you have the Kitos War around the time of Trajan's conquests in the east in the AD 110s, and then you have the by far the most challenging Jewish revolt the Romans faced, which was the Bar Kokhba revolt in the AD 130s. And certainly in the latter, it seems as though at least one legion was lost. So the Romans lost a lot of troops, including a legion, in the Jewish revolts. And finally, you have the Roman-Parthian War from AD 161 to 165, when, at the very beginning in AD 161, when the Parthian king Volgasses IV invades from Armenia towards the Roman province of Cappadocia, the Roman governor in Cappadocia, so this is the northern part of the eastern border, Severianus, decides he's going to take matters into his own hand, decides he's going to be very brave. Takes a legion with him that's unnamed. Remember that. The legion's unnamed, then and now. And he marches the legion into Armenia to try and stop Volgasses, and it's wiped out to a man, and he commits suicide. So we know there a legion's been lost in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and a legion's been lost in the Roman-Parthian War. Both unnamed. So whether that's the 9th Legion or not, we don't know, but certainly the Romans lost a legion there.
So the 9th could have perished fighting in the east. We have the bloody conflict, and we know that legions were lost during this time period. But unfortunately, we still lack clear-cut evidence to support this. We have tantalising references that might support it, but the evidence is still not 100% there.
Well, one might say, well, where's the evidence for it being at all in the East? And I can't produce any. All I can say is what one of my university professors remarked, John Mann, was that the evidence for the existence and positioning of legions in the East is not good. I've been to see 4 of the legionary fortresses on the eastern frontier, and 2 are now underneath the Ataturk dams. 1 is underneath the town of Melitini, Melatia, and only 1 survives and has hardly been touched by excavations. So all these 4 sites have hardly been examined by archaeology, so we don't know what the evidence for their history is. It could be that there is evidence lurking there for the 9th Legion, and that, I think, is an exciting possibility that new evidence will be discovered somewhere along the eastern frontier for the 9th Legion.
But others remain unconvinced.
There is a sort of counter there. I think because Rosemary Sutcliffe's book, The Eagle of the Ninth, and the recent films and so on, has promoted in popular fiction the idea that the 9th was destroyed in Britain, has led historians and archaeologists to go against that and say that, no, ridiculous. There's no evidence of a major, perhaps, uprising. We think the 9th was taken out of Britain and died somewhere else. We know that there are tile stamps in Nijmegen on the Rhine frontier, which probably dates to the mid-80s. We know that parts of the 9th were there, propping up the frontier before they were sent back to Britain again. There's no other fort in the whole of the Roman Empire that has evidence of the 9th. If they're in forts and building stuff, they will be stamping tiles. We've got none of that evidence whatsoever. It's possible they died on another frontier. We hear of significant losses in the east, but the fact that they're not actually mentioned, I mean, documentary sources for the time aren't great. But for me, I would say I would be 99.9% sure that they died fighting in Britain, because that's where they're based. It makes no sense to take them out before then and for them to die somewhere else. The probability is they're fighting and dying, trying to hold Britain together rather than going anywhere else. I mean, the fact that they are replaced by the 6th Legion, to me, suggests that they've borne the brunt of the fighting. They haven't disgraced themselves, because we still hear of ex-soldiers from the 9th who've retired and go on to live, as far as we can tell, a happy life 20, 30 years later. But I think they were very severely mauled to the point where they had so many losses they just can't be replaced. You can't just recruit more people to fill the gaps in there. It's easier to bring another legion over and to replace them and to absorb whoever survived into different legions and different units. So I think the evidence, as far as we can see, is more suggestive that the 9th died fighting, and they probably died somewhere in that area of York.
So the candidates are lost in the north of Britain, lost in the south of Britain, lost on the Rhine and Danube, lost in the east. I would put them in this order. Number 1, lost in the north. Number 2, lost in the east. Number 3, lost in the south of Britain. Number 4, lost on the Rhine and Danube. I believe it's most likely that the 9th Legion was lost in the north of Britain, because there's no evidence it ever left the province, apart from that one single vexillation going to Nijmegen, nothing else.
I mean, the good thing about archaeology is that every new find changes the theory. If we find tiles with IX HISP in Judea or along the Danube frontier, brilliant. We can say we know that the 9th was moved out and they did die somewhere else. At the moment we haven't got that, so our best guess is that they died in Britain.
The possibility of them being lost somewhere in Britain remains, the possibility of them being lost somewhere on the Rhine, or just a disbandment. But it remains one of the mysteries. We need to find out.
What happened to the 9th Legion is a question that will continue to captivate imaginations and divide opinion. Was it lost in Britain, or did it get transferred and did it perish on another frontier of the Roman Empire? The debate continues. The truth is, we can't really make an absolute statement of what happened to the 9th Legion until archaeology uncovers some new groundbreaking evidence. But that makes me very excited for the future. We only need this new archaeological discovery and it could solve the mystery once and for all. The fate of the 9th Legion may be a mystery for now, but hopefully not forever.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.